Hi, my name is Brendan Long, and this is my final video explaining the design decisions that I made in creating my infographic about the world of beer. So in deciding what models to use and to emulate, I decided to use two. The one on the left, the Women at War model, represents my color model, while the Discover Wisconsin model on the right is responsible for my typography, layout, and visual language. And I chose it because I like the simplicity. I like the kind of like the lack of outlines and like the use of fills. And I also like the way that it really moves linearly top to bottom. Those are all things I tried to work on in my own work. So when I go through the different components that I want to talk about within my infographic, I'm kind of going to split it into the top and the bottom as it's a very vertically, I guess, oriented design. So for visual potential, if you look at the top of the screen, I have a appearance display that is used as my title. It has a picture of I guess, a mug of beer. It seems very recognizable, both the colors used and the shape of it, to identify that this is an infographic about beer. And through my experiences in the quarter, that was something that was getting across consistently. So coming down into the time display, I decided to do a timeline. And so some of the things that I received some criticism for, but decided not to change. The timeline is obviously not evenly, I guess, like separated or set up based on the years. You can see that the first year in 4300 BC in the year 1000 obviously are the same distance as some dates on the right side that are a lot closer together. But realistically, it made this look really messy when I looked into what it would look like to make it more to scale. And I thought the consistency of it worked a lot better just to leave it like this. So you can see I used an arrow. There wasn't really any arrows in my visual language model, but I did think it was important to get the message across that this was moving across, I guess, time. So that's why I decided to include that. And the main emphasis of this time display was just how long the history of beer is, how long it's been around, and kind of how far back in time some of the major innovations and events in beer history have occurred. And I think I got that across well, just because a major thing that most people noticed during critiques was just how far back some of those dates go. Finally, for the relationship display, I decided to do a family tree, seeing as beer is something that has a lot of derivations. And these are on the bottom here, you see the bottles. Those are actual types of beer, and then there's subgroups above them. And then the main categories of ales and lagers up top. And these aren't every type of beer. This is a significant portion of like the popular beers, but I really want to get the message across that there's a lot of different types and that they're interconnected and interrelated. I think it's really important to see that sometimes there's multiple beers that came from the same family, or they're kind of split off and there's some slight differences, but they all share some common ancestry. And so that's something that I really tried to emphasize with my relationship display. So moving down to the bottom half of my infographic, on the top there you can see my location display, and I decided to use something that looked very similar to my visual language model and the map I used there. That's something that will come up a little bit later, and I can kind of show you again how those connect. But I really wanted to kind of keep the location display simple, but I also wanted to kind of highlight which places in the country are known for producing beer. I thought this was done well. I used this consistent gold color in a lot of my work to highlight things that I really wanted people to see prominently. And so I think it does a good job of really highlighting the parts of the country that produce a lot of beer. I also tried to I thought about doing like a hierarchy in terms of this top 10 states and putting like rankings or putting state names. But at the end of the day, it fit my visual language model a lot better to not include state names or state ranks on it, as it kept a lot more simple. And I felt like when I put it in, I lost like the clean feel that I feel appears now. If you go down to the numbers display, you can see that I have an assortment of different things. A lot of them are based off of my model, the bar chart, as well as the kind of stacked columns, or the stacked cylinders are both taken directly from mine, as well as the idea of these icons with the kind of like the cursive number with the little description below it. That's something that I saw in my model and something that I worked to emulate. And the main point of my numbers display is just how popular that beer is all over the world. I initially had the bars in the chart as gold, so it really emphasized how how different countries differ in their beer drinking. But after speaking during a check-in with Marilyn, I decided to make those kind of in the in the background rather than the foreground. I decided to put the emphasis on the title, and the emphasis on how much everyone drinks rather than how much like a specific country drinks. And I still do emphasize below. You can see the average Czech citizen stat as kind of like a fun fact, but I felt like I did a better job of making sure the emphasis was on just how popular beer is everywhere rather than how popular specific beers or specific countries are in their beer drinking. So the visual encoding on my relationship display, I did make a family tree. It has a pretty standard kind of like top-down relationship where you can see that ales and lagers are these larger families that are then made up of subdivisions like pale ales, darker ales, etc. And then each of those subdivisions have specific types of beer. I think I really emphasized that final bottom row represented actual types of beer rather than just like general, I guess like subtypes by putting those into those beer bottles. And another major decision I made was I felt like the bottom of the screen when I had all of the beer bottles the same color was really hard to read, as it was almost overwhelming how many beer bottles were down there. So I decided to use a color scheme on both dark and light beer to kind of distinguish between different types of beer and kind of give some context between I guess the subtypes that generally produce dark beer versus the subtypes that generally produce light beer, and etc. That was something that was not immediately apparent to people. When I came through for my critique, I guess I had a skewed perspective of the knowledge that people have about beers generally. So I did add a bit of a key you can see below there to help to emphasize that to people what I was trying to show. So color was a fun one for me. I came in a little bit scared because of the whole colorblind thing, but I think I managed to do a pretty decent job in this department. I have the same kind of green background, and then I really tried to utilize the kind of like goldish color as like an emphasis point on things that I really wanted people to look at and focus on. And I think that worked fairly well. What one thing I will say that I strayed from a bit was I leaned on using white text versus kind of the light gray that you see more commonly in my color model. And the reason for this was I guess like one of the problems I kind of had with the color model was I felt like a lot of the text was hard to read. So I tried to use a little bit higher contrast backgrounds and text colors when creating my model, just to make it easier to read. But that is something that I did that deviated from my model, and that's something that's worth noting. Also, I did use like the dark brown colors you see in a lot of like the boxes and figures on the left color model. And those were kind of like the colors I used when I didn't want something highlighted necessarily, but it needed to maybe be boxed off, or I needed like a color for my icon. So the various shades are the other things that you'll see consistently on here. And then finally, I think a really important point as well, the red that's used in the color model really kind of it's significantly different than a lot of the other colors, and so saw that used in the title, and I decided to basically just use it for all of my titles as well as my subheadings on those banners that you see in my model or in my infographic. So for my typography model, the fonts that I used weren't the exact same as the fonts in my original because the ones in the original cost money. So I tried to find reasonable substitutes, but it really comes down to the contrast between the script and the sans serif font. I really use the script in points of emphasis. I think the one thing that I can say about the typography, and maybe this goes more into visual language, is that I do have less text than my original model has. And that's something that maybe was something that I lacked and something that I missed in my model. But in general, I thought I did a decent job. I thought the cursive lined up pretty well. And the only thing that I really didn't like about this was the font, the sans serif font that was used in my model. I thought looked pretty good with all caps, but it was a little bit, the letters were a little bit narrower, which allowed it to go all caps and still look pretty good. In my model, I got pretty consistent reviews that people didn't like the all caps, but in an attempt to stick with the typography model and the visual language, I decided to keep that, and I used some additional spacing between letters to try to mitigate that, but it only had so much of an effect. So for visual language, we're going to start with the top part of my infographic again. So the first key thing I want to focus on are the banners. So you can see that top section really mirrors with the beer instead of the Wisconsin state, as well as the cursive font. And then the curved banner that serves as kind of like the header with the sans serif font inside of it. I also worked to throw those like triangles to add like a bit of like a gradient inside of that banner, which I thought helped to make it pop as kind of emphasizing that it is the head slide. And then also I used like the subheading banners below, which were a lot more simple, but that kind of emphasized that they were subheadings. And then the dotted lines across that like kind of falling behind those banners that helped to separate the different sections and what I wanted to talk about. So something I'll call out right now, my visual language model does have very faint lines going across the back. That's something that I wanted to incorporate. Honestly, I kept running into issues trying to incorporate it, and then I know I had spoken to you about it a couple times, life got a little crazy and I didn't have time to implement that down the stretch, but I honestly like the way it looks without it, and I think I did other things throughout my work to help add some depth that maybe didn't require me throwing in that gradient in the background. So another thing I'm going to focus on is the level of detail. I use kind of like I would say like a low to moderate level of detail. Didn't throw in any outlines, just had just the fills in the background, as you can see kind of here with the beer can and the hops. And then really just tried to keep everything simple. I think that was like a key point I was focusing on throughout my work. So on the bottom half, I think there's some more obvious examples of where I really tried to emulate my model. For the first one, if you look up top at that my map, I really tried to emulate the map that was on my original visual language model, which is fairly simple. It has outlines. They actually chose to shade the inside of their states slightly darker than the background. I just chose to keep it roughly the same. As this was more of like a center point, I thought that made it look a little bit more clean. I also, you can see in that my location display, I used the same kind of text box with the arrow pointing at key points that I wanted to emphasize. And then you can also see how in like where the map is, they have kind of like this like title on top of an image that kind of describes like what they're trying to show, which is kind of why I decided to put like the outline of a keg there. And then also, if you notice, there's some sections in the model where they put like this like cursive font as kind of like these little like blurbs and like fun, I don't know, things to throw out there. You can see a great example of this is in the column graph That's the Holy Moly We're Growing up near the top of the page on my model, and then the World Loves Beer near the bottom of the page on my model, where they just throw it on top of the graph. I and then have like a little bit of a more description below in the sans serif font. I didn't choose to include grid lines in my graph. I originally had it without them, but after looking at my visual language model, I tried to fit it a little bit more closely. I also tried to use the same stacked cylinder graph representation as how these things stack up, and I thought that that was something that I could also incorporate, so that's something that I did with different beer brands. One thing you will notice on both the beer brands cylinder stack and the bar graph, I have them going kind of the opposite direction as my model. I wanted to emphasize people who drank the most beer, and I wasn't moving in chronological order in my bar graph, so that's probably the reason that I decided to put it that direction. And then for the top American beer brands in sales, I had the little blurb about Budweiser selling a lot of beer at the bottom, and so I decided to put Budweiser down there to kind of like put those two next to each other. The last little thing I think I'll mention, there's a bunch of examples of this where there's some sort of like image or like a collection of images, and then a little bit of cursive text with like a description below it. You can see in the bottom of my model, like the 1.6x average Czech citizen slide. There's like a good example of that where I tried to match up with like the 500,000 Scotty Levin vacation planning Midwesterners with with the picture of all those people. So that's something I also really tried to emulate. So in terms of visual hierarchy, I definitely will work to create kind of like a top to bottom story of beer, kind of going in like a logical progression that I guess I'll talk more about in my layout slide. But so I definitely tried to make it look like something that you would logically go top to bottom on and like kind of hit each section in the order in which I intended people to. Something I think I maybe missed here. I will say that I don't think I did a great job using size to create emphasis. I think there was there also in my visual language model, most of the components are roughly the same size, but I do think that I could have done a better job of making certain things that I wanted more to be more obvious, more prominent by making them larger, or by positioning them a little bit differently. I think this is something maybe that I could have done a little bit better on. So in terms of unity and variety, I think ways that I definitely unified my work was utilizing those subheading banners that you see, those square kind of shapes with the dotted lines across like the top. I think that did a good job of kind of like creating individual sections, really showing people where one idea started and one idea ended. And then other things I want to emphasize are how I work to create variety in terms of both color and type. So in terms of color, there were a limited number of colors that I used. It was mostly kind of the shades of that brown color, along with the gold, a little bit of black, a little bit of red, a little bit of white. But I really wanted to make sure that I didn't use too much of that anywhere. Originally, I had in that bar chart down on the bottom section with the World Loves Beer title on top of it, I had made all those bars gold, and then at another point in time, all of the beer bottles in my relationship display up 2/3 of the way up the infographic were also all gold. And what I started to realize when I was creating these individual models was that there was just a lot of gold, and so it went from being something that I intended to be a point of emphasis to something that became overwhelming and became kind of the standard color. And so I kind of scaled it back so I could focus on helping that color be something I use as a point of emphasis rather than like kind of like the default color I use when creating like a picture or a graphic. So finally on the layout, there's a few pretty obvious ones. First of all, the title on the top. As you can see, the the only thing that I did work to improve, and I did improve somewhat, but it's still not great, is just the use of space in that top section. This is something I was struggling with down the stretch. I initially just had the word beer inside of the beer mug, and the curved banner was also a bit smaller. And while I honestly liked it better originally, it just left so much blank space that it felt like it was less of like a title and more of like this icon slapped in like the top of the middle of this the screen. So I worked to kind of add more text. I made the color on the beer mug that wasn't like that beer color slightly darker, so that, and then added a little bit to the drop shadow to make it a little bit more emphasized and made it easier to read. But I still do think that it does a decent job of kind of showing that, hey, this is where we're starting, this is the title, this is what we're going to be talking about. As we move down, you can see there's a pretty obvious progression in that I used these kind of square like banner headers, subheaders, I guess, to separate all of my individual sections. I kind of don't have the exact same size on some of these things that I do on my layout model, but I felt like I needed to organize it to make more logical sense rather than trying to emulate just like the shapes and like the size of the components in this. So I decided to start with the timeline, and as I thought that was a good introduction into saying like, here's beer, beer's really old. Here's like when some of these things that you know today came into existence, and then I move into types of beer, where the emphasis is on how many different types of beer there are, how beers are all interconnected, how they all come from kind of the same genealogy. The idea basically that just like you could look at a bunch of different species of animals and see that they all came from the same place and some of them share similar ancestry, like you can do the same thing with beer. So also, if you go down to my location display on like the where's beer made, here's where I'm kind of trying to show like, all right, so you know that there's a lot of different types of beer, and you know that beer's been around a long time, but like where is this beer coming from? And so that is what I did with like the emphasis on like those gold colored states. And then finally on the bottom, in the facts and figures, this is where you see like beer is huge. Like beer exists in a million different places. It's popular everywhere. And just like the expansiveness and the reach of the beer industry is something that I emphasized down there, and I thought it was a good way of tying up my work. And then finally at the bottom, you just see the sources. I had like a little bit of a footer. I didn't have like a logo similar to my layout model, but I thought I did an okay job just with having a bit of a footer to wrap things up there. So thanks for listening to my video as I kind of describe some of the design decisions and some of the, I guess, ideas that I work to explore while creating my infographic. I also want to thank you for all of your help this quarter. Both Stephanie and Marilyn, both of you guys through your check-ins, were very helpful in helping me not only use Illustrator, but to kind of understand the types of decisions I was making and how they would impact like my overall work. I came in with no experience with Illustrator or Photoshop or anything like that, so this was definitely a learning experience for me, but I think I came out of it a lot more cognizant of the types of decisions I was making in my design, and definitely something I'll use going forward. So thanks, and hope you guys all have a great summer.